Hello and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. My name is Lewis McGlynn.
Hello and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. My name is Saoirse Healy.
Hello and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. My name is Donald C. Stewart. Broadcasting Scotland is Scotland's independent broadcaster, providing factual news, reporting on the issues important to the people of Scotland.
We are committed to public service broadcasting, and with your support, we will produce even more programmes.
Provide opportunities for young people interested in media production and broadcasting, and challenge preconceptions of what Scottish media looks like, amplifying Scotland's voice and reflecting its communities.
We can already deliver high-quality live news, and we will create the highest quality programmes for you to enjoy, but we can only do that with your support.
So please subscribe to and share our channel or donate to Broadcasting Scotland via the link in the description. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good morning. The first item of business is general questions, and at question number 1 I call Emma Harper.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government what support it provides to people who are going through family court proceedings.
Minister Siobhan Brown.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The Scottish Government provides funding to a range of voluntary sector bodies who can provide support in relation to family disputes. Support may also be available through the legal aid system.
Emma Harper.
Thank the Minister for that answer. I've been working with a family in Wigtonshire who are in the same position as many others, where a contact order was given by a sheriff for a father to have contact with his son months ago, and it is still not being complied with. The Minister will know that I have corresponded with her on this issue, but would she agree to meet with me to explore whether, such as for criminal cases, a change could be made to the law which would compel a party to comply with a court order in a Scottish family court?
Minister.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Delay in child contact proceedings is not in the child's best interest, and I recognise the negative effect that non-compliance and with contact orders can have on a child. If a person believes an order has not been obeyed, they can go back to the court and they can ask for the order to be varied, or they can ask for the person who did not obey the order to be held in contempt of court. New case management rules for family actions in the Sheriff Court came into effect in September last year, and these are intended to help to prevent undue delay in proceedings relating to welfare of children, and I would be very happy to meet with Ms Harper to discuss this further.
Thank you. Question number 2, Ariane Burgess.
To ask the Scottish Government what assurance it can provide to the community on Mull regarding whether Learning Estate Investment Programme funding can be used flexibly to support both the construction of a new high school in Craignure and the refurbishment of the existing site in Tobermory for nursery and primary provision.
Cabinet Secretary Jenny Gilruth.
I can provide the member with a direct assurance that within the Learning Estate and Investment Programme there are a wide range of locations, including remote sites, and a variety of school types, including campuses and stand-alone schools, new builds, extensions and refurbishments, depending on the needs of different communities. Initial discussions with Argyll and Bute Council are based on the LEAP's policy of like-for-like replacement funding, but also recognise the specific circumstances of the existing Tobermory campus and, for example, the likely increased costs due to the island location. Therefore, LEAP funding based on like-for-like assessment could potentially support the construction of a new high school in Craignure and the refurbishment or replacement of the existing site in Tobermory for nursery and primary provision, if that is deemed to be the best option. Any additional costs arising from not pursuing a like-for-like approach would have to be borne by the Council. We will continue to work with the Council to support the development of this project.
Ariane Burgess.
I appreciate that answer from the Minister. I'm raising this issue because the community have come to me, and unfortunately this is another example of island communities feeling their voices are unheard and their very particular challenges overlooked. The Special Islands Need Allowance is supposed to recognise the increased cost of delivering services to island communities, but it has dwindled due to a failure to link this to inflation. Will the Scottish Government seek to address this unfairness?
Cabinet Secretary.
I thank the member for her question. First of all, I very much recognise that some certain members of the community strongly feel that having a split site option with early years and primary remaining in Tobermory and a new secondary school being built on a site in a more central island location would mean that families would no longer need to send their children to Open. So I recognise the unique circumstances that the member speaks to. The member has highlighted in the Chamber today the Islands Needs Allowance. Of course, responsibility for that does not rest within my portfolio responsibilities. I'm more than happy to write to the member directly on this, although I suspect it will be another minister responding to her on that ask. But I go back to my original response, Presiding Officer, in relation to the flexibility with regard to LEAP funding, which is that if Argyll and Bute Council decide that a two-site option is best for their community, there is flexibility within the LEAP fund at the current time to reallocate the funding from a single campus to the two-site proposal. But of course that additionality would have to be borne by the local authority.
Question number 3, Clare Haughey.
To ask the Scottish Government how the Scottish Budget 2025-26 will support the NHS.
Cabinet Secretary Neil Gray.
Thank you, President Officer. With record funding of over £21 billion provided in this year's proposed budget, we aim to improve patient experience, ensuring the journey from diagnosis to treatment to aftercare is as straightforward and stress-free as possible. A commitment to provide £200 million to reduce waiting times and improve capacity, with a vow to make the system more efficient and reduce delayed discharge. It means that by March 2026, over 150,000 extra patients are expected to be treated as a result. Despite substantial funding increases, significant challenge remains, meaning that prevention and reform remain critical to delivering a sustainable health and social care system.
Clare Haughey.
Thank you, and I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that answer. And I remind Chamber I hold a bank nurse contract with Greater Glasgow and Clyde NHS. My constituents often contact me regarding support for long-term health conditions. In particular, access to diabetes technology has been raised by my Rutherglen constituents with me. Can the Minister detail how measures in this year's budget will support those requiring long-term treatment?
Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you, President Officer. I thank Clare Haughey for bringing up a point that is absolutely central to the elements of reform and improvement that I spoke about. Addressing concerns around long-term conditions and managing them better is central to those aims, and the Government is committed to supporting people with long-term conditions for those reasons. On the question of diabetes tech, this year alone we've provided funding for 2,100 people to receive a hybrid closed-loop system. It will continue to support these people with recurring funding for as long as they use the system, and are working on plans for expansion in 2025. The 25-26 budget also includes an additional £4.5 million to deliver new specialist support across the country for the likes of long COVID, ME, chronic fatigue and other similar conditions. And this important investment will support people with these conditions across Scotland, and we're asking Parliament to unite behind the budget to ensure that these funding elements reach the people who really need it.
Brief supplementary, Carol Mockin.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. A recent Audit Scotland report on alcohol and drug services recommended that Scottish Government must increase funding to tackle alcohol-related harm by mid-2025. However, the budget indicates that these services received a real terms funding cut. How does the Scottish Government respond to Alcohol Focus Scotland's assessment that the budget in its current form is lacking in the ambition and determination needed to tackle Scotland's alcohol emergency?
Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you. I thank Carol Mochan for raising an important issue and one that is a priority for this government. And we have maintained alcohol and drug funding, including the National Mission funding of £60 million a year, the £250 million across the lifetime of this Parliament. We've also baselined a significant amount of money, £19 million into ADP funding, to give long-term certainty, which is what was one of the asks from alcohol and drug partnerships. And of course, alongside the funding that we provide, there's also wider health board intervention that isn't readily available within the budget document that speaks to services being delivered in communities. And on that basis, I hope Carol Mochan can be reassured that this remains a significant priority for this government.
Question number 4, Emma Roddick.
To ask the Scottish Government whether it will provide an update on how it is tackling child poverty, including in the Highlands and Islands region.
Cabinet Secretary Shirley-Anne Somerville.
The Scottish Budget for 25-26 outlines plans for wide-ranging investment to drive further progress in our national mission to eradicate child poverty. In addition to continued investment in the likes of the Scottish Child Payment, this includes our increased investment in affordable housing supply, investment to expand breakfast clubs, and by expanding free school meals to pupils in primary 6 and 7 who receive the Scottish Child Payment. Importantly, we have also committed £3 million to develop the systems required to mitigate the two-child cap, with CPAG estimating that scrapping the cap could lift around 15,000 children out of poverty in Scotland.
Emma Roddick.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that answer and note that today is Christmas Jumper Day, which gives us an opportunity to reflect on what more we can do to ensure that no child grows up in poverty in Scotland. As she noted, a number of last week's budget announcements, including the scrapping of Labour's two-child cap and the expansion of free school meals, will help lift thousands of children out of poverty. Can she outline what more we could do and how much further we could go if this Parliament had the powers of a normal, independent country?
Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Emma Roddick raises a very important point, Presiding Officer, because it highlights the fact that under some of the most challenging budget settlements since devolution, we remain committed as a government to over £3 billion in 24-25 to policies which tackle poverty and protect people as far as possible during the cost of living crisis. But she is also right to point out that we could do so much more if we had the full economic and fiscal powers of an independent nation, because only with independence would we stop having to mitigate against the UK government. This year, £134 million for the bedroom tax, the benefit cap and others, nearly £500 million for the Scottish Child Payment, and next year the work that we will have to do to mitigate against the scrapping of the Universal Winter Fuel Payment and our work because there is still, unfortunately, the retention of the two-child cap at the UK. While the UK government makes those decisions, we will take action now, but with independence we could do so much more.
Question number 5, Neil Bibby.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government how it determines what constitutes a major service change in the NHS.
Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Scottish Ministers consider a range of factors, including the views of Healthcare Improvement Scotland and the Health Board, before coming to a final decision on whether a proposed change should be considered major. NHS boards can also consider if a proposed change is a major service change themselves. Healthcare Improvement Scotland have published guidance to help NHS boards identify potentially major service changes, and the guidance poses questions for NHS boards to consider under 8 key areas, including impact on patients and carers, the level of public concern, financial implications and consequences for other services, amongst others.
Neil Bibby.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that response. Proposals to close Ward 36 at the RAH in Paisley for older adults, resulting in the removal of 22 beds, are proceeding despite significant opposition from NHS staff, the Unison Trade Union, families and patients, over the impact this could have on delayed discharge and the wider hospital. The Healthcare Improvement Scotland's guidance outlines key factors for designating a major service change, including the impact on patients and carers, changes in accessibility, public and political concern, consequences for other services and alterations in service delivery methods, each of which is clearly relevant to the closure of Ward 36. So in light of this, will the Cabinet Secretary pause this proposed closure until a full public consultation is carried out?
Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you. I thank Neil Bibby for raising an important issue, one that I also raised with NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde and discussed with them at the recent board annual review that I was part of a couple of weeks ago. And I think, to be fair to Mr Bibby, he reflects one element of the decision but not the other in terms of what the capacity is going to be used for, because this specific ward has been used for some time for patients awaiting home care or care home placement who are otherwise medically fit for discharge. And in line with national policy on appropriately shifting the balance of care, minimising delayed discharge, the Health Board is embarking on a test of change where these resources will be directed instead to supporting hospital-at-home services in Renfrewshire. So the test will be kept under review. If successful, the potential for a longer-term change will be investigated. But I hope that puts that into greater context for Mr Bibby and his constituents, as well as the trade union representatives who I also had that discussion with, and gives them some reassurance as to the actions that have been taken by Greater Glasgow and Clyde.
Brief supplementary, Colin Beattie.
I understand that NHS board leaders were contacted 2 weeks ago by the Scottish Government, outlining a changed approach to planning of services in NHS Scotland, focusing on moving to population-level planning. Can the Cabinet Secretary please speak to how this will help meet changing needs of Scotland and build the foundation for the transformation of our healthcare services?
Brief response, Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you, President Officer. I think Colin Beattie raises an important issue here, that as part of the reform agenda we've developed a renewed approach to the planning of services in NHS Scotland to ensure that services planning takes place best aligned to the size of the population who make use of these services. There will be a significant change to the way that we plan and deliver services to enable to meet changing needs of Scotland's population and build the foundation for the transformation of our service. But to give reassurance, this is obviously based upon clinical input from our national conversation, as well as the views of patients, as I was able to discuss with patient representatives this morning.
To number 6, Brian Whittle.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government, further to the publication of the Access Principles in November 2023 by the General Practice Access Short Life Working Group, what work it is undertaken to develop a set of standards or performance indicators to evaluate the performance of GP access models?
Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. We continue to work together with all relevant partners to effectively implement the General Practice Access Principles, including through our commitment to the ongoing recruitment of primary care multidisciplinary teams, as well as 800 more GPs. Healthcare Improvement Scotland has already worked with over 100 general practices to improve access arrangements, and it is ultimately for individual practices to assess whether their access arrangements meet the needs of their patients.
Whittle.
Can I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that answer? Over the past year, GP services in my region have begun moving to purely digital points of access for the service. As the Cabinet Secretary is aware, I am hugely supportive of the use of digital infrastructure to relieve pressures on the NHS. However, the integration of digital services must not create barriers to access. Recently, I have become aware of access issues that have had negative impacts on patients, like increased waiting times for GP appointments or missed triage that have landed patients in A&E. Does the Cabinet Secretary agree this is an important issue to monitor as we change our access models, and how is the Scottish Government ensuring that integration of technology is properly resourced?
Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you. I think Brian Whittle raises two really important issues. One, that when we adopt new innovation, particularly where that is patient-facing innovation, that we must take people with us on that, and that we can't have an equity of access based on digital literacy in this case, as Brian Whittle is setting out. And secondly, the whole purpose of adopting innovation and taking forward greater digitisation is to improve and speed up, provide greater capacity within our service. And so that would be what I would expect to be coming forward. And of course, conversations are continuing with the BMA, the Royal College of GPs and others around how we can make sure there is an equity to access, and also that we can improve capacity on the back of the budget proposals that we've taken forward on providing greater capacity within primary care and general practice in particular.
Question number 7, Maggie Chapman.
To ask the Scottish Government what action it will take to enhance the sustainability of cultural facilities in the North East Scotland region, including to prevent job losses in the sector and improve support for cultural education.
Cabinet Secretary Angus Robertson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and to Maggie Chapman for her question. Creative Scotland have invested over £30 million in applications from individuals, from projects and organisations in the North East Parliamentary region since 2019, with over 1,400 awards. This includes over 40 projects totalling £1.7 million through Screen Scotland's Screen Education programmes, 6 Culture Collective projects totalling £2.9 million, 12 regularly funded organisations receiving a total of £12.5 million each year, and Youth Music Initiative formula funding to all 5 local authority areas in the region each year, which in 2024-25 totalled £1.2 million.
Maggie Chapman.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that answer. Culture is a fundamental human right, an important part of our expression and identity, and it has a positive impact on our lives and supports social connections and well-being. As Dundee marks the 10th anniversary of being the first and only UNESCO City of Design in the UK, key cultural organisations and the creative economies they support are at risk. Has the Cabinet Secretary engaged with Dundee Contemporary Arts, Dundee Rep and other organisations about their sustainability? And does he agree that the move to multi-year funding would give these cultural institutions the long-term financial guarantees they need?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, can I say, I think Maggie Chapman makes an excellent point about multi-annual year funding, and as a result of the Scottish Government's proposed budget, there will be the biggest ever funding increase for the culture sector in Scotland outside COVID recovery. This will allow the introduction of multi-annual year funding for cultural venues and organisations throughout Scotland. However, I would gently say to her and to colleagues in other political parties across this chamber, this is only going to happen if MSPs pass the budget. So I hope Maggie Chapman will vote for the budget, will vote for the increase in culture funding and give the green light to multi-annual year funding.
Thank you. I'll just take this opportunity to remind Ms Chapman and all other members that large campaigning symbols are not allowed in this chamber. I'll take a very brief question, number 8, from Willie Rennie.
To ask the Scottish Government what its response is to reports that both privately run nurseries in the East Neuk in North East Fife constituency will close by the end of 2024.
Minister Natalie Donounis.
I know from engagement with the sector that many providers are facing cost and workforce pressures, and the UK Government's changes to employers' national insurance contributions are only going to add to this. I continue to prioritise efforts to support providers in Scotland, and provided we have support from parties across the chamber for this budget, we will give an additional £9.7 million to councils to enable workers in private and third sector services delivering funded ELC to continue to be paid at least the real living wage, meaning Scotland will be the only part of the UK to do so. We're also continuing our work with COSLA to strengthen the sustainable rates setting process.
That sustainable rate setting process is really important. Closing the gap between the funding for councils and private nurseries is part of the reason why these 2 nurseries are in difficulty. So can she update us about how quickly that gap is going to be closed?
Minister.
I'm absolutely happy to provide an update on that. So, jointly with COSLA, we've established a Sustainable Rates Review Implementation Working Group that brings together sector and local government reps to inform delivery of the Sustainable Rates Review actions. A key recommendation of that review was to improve the cost data available to inform rate setting, and I'm pleased to update that the Scottish Government has just completed the commissioning exercise for a new national cost collection exercise, and this will take place in spring next year. We've also, together with COSLA, hosted 6 provider reference groups during October and November, and we've had really good involvement from across the sector in relation to that to inform that cost collection exercise. I've also got some other things to update Mr Rennie on, and I'd be happy to do that, as I believe I need to keep this short. Thank you.
Thank you. That concludes general questions. We move to First Minister's questions, and at question number 1 I call Russell Finlay.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Scotland's schools are critical to the fortunes and future of our country. But after 17 years of SNP rule, pupils and teachers are being failed. The SNP's 2021 manifesto promised to increase teacher numbers by 3,500. Therefore, at the very least, they should be rising. So, First Minister, are they?
First Minister.
On Tuesday, the annual teacher census reported that there has been a reduction from last year to this year of 621 in teacher numbers, and that was the subject of a statement which the Cabinet Secretary for Education gave to Parliament on Tuesday. In response to that, the Government, as part of the budget settlement, has negotiated an agreement with local authorities in which the Government and local authorities will work together to ensure that teacher numbers are restored to 2023 levels, which means that over the course of the next year, teacher numbers will increase.
Russell Finlay.
Well, as the First Minister just admitted, Scottish Government figures this week show that teacher numbers are not up 3,500 as SNP promised, but down by 600 in this year alone. As Education Secretary, John Swinney himself promised more teachers, but instead there are fewer, and he won't ever accept responsibility. So does he at least accept that fewer teachers are having a negative impact in Scotland's classrooms?
First Minister.
President Officer, I want to see teacher numbers rising, which is why the Government has negotiated an agreement with local authorities, which is about restoring teacher numbers to their 2023 levels. But I think it's really important that we look at the outcomes that are achieved as a consequence of the investments made by the Government and by local authorities. So, figures published this week show record levels of attainment in literacy and numeracy in our schools, and the attainment gap in literacy has reduced to its lowest level ever. The attainment gap in positive destinations has reduced by 60%. The attainment gap in positive destinations has reduced by 60% since 2009-10. And now
Let us hear the First Minister.
And now 92.8% of school leavers were in positive destinations 9 months after leaving school in 2022-23. Now, many of these efforts were put in train by me as Education Secretary.
Let us hear the First Minister.
Many of these measures were put in place by me as Education Secretary, recognising that if we want to close the poverty-related attainment gap, poverty that has been made worse by the decisions of the last Conservative government in the United Kingdom, we have to take long-term action and have long-term commitment to strengthening education, and that's precisely what this government has delivered.
Russell Finlay.
I would need all day to list all of the SNP's broken promises on the attainment gap. The truth is, fewer teachers are being expected to do more and more, and this is fuelling a collapse in discipline in our schools. Last year alone, there were almost 45,000 recorded incidents of violence and abuse. One teacher told me that female pupils and teachers routinely suffer sexual intimidation and even violence. Girls are too scared to use mixed-sex toilets because they risk being photographed under cubicle doors. As a parent, I'd be worried. It would make my blood boil. Frankly, I would be on the warpath. These shocking incidents are happening because disruptive pupils know there are no consequences for their actions. And isn't it time for the SNP to crack down on the behaviour of the minority who are ruining it for the majority?
First Minister.
Well, the Government is taking forward action to address behaviour in our schools. It's part of the action plan that the Education Secretary has set out to Parliament, and schools are empowered to take decisions which are designed to address unacceptable behaviour. And let me make it absolutely crystal clear that any of the behaviour that Mr Finlay has recounted to Parliament today, which I know does take place in our schools, is completely and utterly intolerable within our schools. But what I cannot allow Mr Finlay to do is to denigrate the achievements made by our educators in our schools. Because when we have statistics published on Tuesday which show there are record levels of attainment in literacy and numeracy in our schools, I will not have that denigrated by the leader of the Conservative Party. And what I'll tell Mr Finlay is that the measures that have been taken by the last Conservative government to exacerbate poverty in our society have made the challenge ever greater to this government, but this government is going to deliver on Scottish education.
Russell Finlay.
I'll say this very slowly for the First Minister. He and his government have been entirely responsible for Scotland's education system for 17 years, no one else. And he talks about an action plan, but there was also a summit last year and it didn't achieve anything. If a nation's success was measured in talking shops, then Scotland would truly be world-leading. And instead of letting violence continue, the SNP must empower teachers to take a tougher approach where necessary. But all John Swinney has done is cut teacher numbers, he's broken promises, let standards slip and allowed toxic behaviour to spiral out of control. After 17 years of SNP rule, our schools need change. John Swinney's way is not working for pupils, it's not working for teachers and it's not working for parents. Isn't it plain common sense what our schools need? More discipline
us here,
and
Mr.
more
Finlay.
teachers.
First Minister.
I've made it clear that unacceptable behaviour in our schools must be tackled within our schools, and we have provided the approaches that are necessary to do that, and schools should feel empowered to do that. But how we will not be able to increase teacher numbers if we follow Mr Finlay's plans. Because this is now the third week I'm going to remind Parliament about the folly that Mr Finlay has put in front of us. He argues for a tax cut of £1 billion in public expenditure, which will reduce public spending by £1 billion, and the savings he has identified total £54 million. He has a £950 million gaping hole.
Let us hear the First Minister.
He has a 900...
First Minister, if I may, I am aware of loud shouts coming from across this chamber. If members have not been called to speak, please don't. First Minister.
There's a £950 million gaping hole of public spending cuts in Mr Finlay's plans, and when I watched him being interviewed on television on Sunday, he could not provide one specific answer to any of the issues about where the cuts would come. It was an embarrassing interview, which the Conservative Party should be embarrassed. Now, Presiding Officer, there are school pupils watching this exchange in the gallery today. And I would say quite simply this: if the behaviour of the Conservative Party in this chamber was prevalent in the schools of our country, that behaviour needs to be confronted, and the Conservatives are a disgrace in this Parliament.
We move to question number 2. I call Anna Sarwar.
Presiding Officer, this week it was revealed that 40% of pupils in Scotland have additional support needs, a new record. But at the same time, the number of ASN teachers has fallen by 400 on the SNP's watch. And just this morning, the National Parent Forum for Scotland has said many parents are left feeling that their children are being failed by our current system. Education was supposed to be this government's top priority, but it's clear that John Swinney and the SNP have failed. So does he accept that we need a change of direction from the Education Secretary and this SNP government?
First Minister.
I think what we have to do is to listen carefully to the views and the contribution of educators and families to make sure that the needs of children are being met, which is exactly what the Education Secretary has done, and it's exactly why the Government in its draft budget has set out an additional £29 million of investment for additional support needs, along with increased resources to support teacher employment within our schools, an increase of £40 million, if my memory serves me right, in additional expenditure on supporting teacher numbers to make sure that the resources are in place. And of course that comes on top of a real terms increase in the core grant for local authorities to make sure that local authorities are able to invest more in education should they choose to do so. So I think what the Government has done in the budget is to provide the tools to local authorities to address the very issues that Mr Sarwar puts to me, and I look forward to the Labour Party supporting the Government's budget when the time comes.
Sarwar.
Presiding Officer, John Swinney has been passing budgets for 17 years and things keep getting worse in Scotland, so I think he needs to wake up to the reality facing Scotland's pupils. Educators, families and charities are saying that this government is failing Scotland's children. I said that 40% of children in Scotland have additional support needs, but many of them not getting the support they need. And also 1 in 3 children are regularly absent from school. And that's the best answer we can expect from a former Education Secretary. The fact of the matter is that children across Scotland aren't getting the support they need, and that will impact on their whole lives. Education is meant to be the great leveller in our country that allows every child to thrive. But under this SNP government, Scotland's young people are not being given the opportunities they deserve. Children absent from school, missing out on the education they need. Pupils with ASN not being supported, holding back their potential. And thousands of children crying out for help but being rejected from mental health services. So can I ask John Swinney, why is this SNP government failing Scotland's children?
First Minister.
I don't accept what Mr Salwar has set out, and the measures the government is taking are having a positive impact on the attainment of children and young people in our education system. So let me return to the data I went through with Mr Finlay, because it needs repeating, because Mr Salwar has obviously not been able to adjust his questions based on the answers that I've given to Mr Finlay. So the first point I'll make...
Let's hear one another.
The first point I'll make... Oh, I'm answering the question, Mr Bibby. I don't need any prompting.
First Minister, if I may, let's conduct ourselves in a courteous and orderly manner. First Minister.
So the first point I want to make is that figures published this week show that record levels of attainment in literacy and numeracy in our schools have been achieved, and the attainment gap in literacy has reduced to its lowest level ever. The attainment gap in positive destinations has reduced by 60% since 2009-10. 92.8% of school leavers were in positive destinations 9 months after leaving school in 2022-23. And when young people leave school, figures published just today show that more Scottish students than ever before are securing a place at university, including record numbers from our most deprived communities. Now, in addition to that, the Government has secured agreement about an increase in teacher numbers with local authorities. We have also secured agreement about reducing teacher contact time to give teachers and professionals the opportunity to develop their practice, and we're putting in place resources to improve the levels of attendance in our schools, which are lower as a consequence of the COVID pandemic, and we need to work hard with individual pupils to rebuild their attendance at schools. That is the action and the set of actions of a government that's determined to strengthen Scottish education and to deliver for the people of Scotland.
Anna Sarwar.
I asked about ASN levels. I asked about pupil absence. I asked about children not being able to access mental health services, but John Swinney couldn't think of a different answer that he'd rehearsed before he came to the Parliament. Because the failure in our schools is on John Swinney. Let's not forget he was the Education Secretary that downgraded the results of working class kids during the pandemic. And now as First Minister, he is overseeing the erosion of our public services. Just this week, it's been revealed record levels of ASN pupils, 1 in 3 children absent from school, falling teacher numbers, crimes of domestic abuse up 11%, GP numbers falling, A&E waits the worst since January, and 100 times as many people waiting over 2 years for treatment compared to England. On every measure, this government has lost its way, and it's Scots paying the price. So why can't John Swinney see what the rest of Scotland can see, that it's time for a new direction?
First Minister.
This Parliament will face a set of decisions in the course of the next few months, which are all about whether we are prepared to invest in strengthening the public services of Scotland. And all of the measures that I've put to Parliament today, and actually Mr Salwar suggests that the issues that he raised were not addressed. I addressed the issue about attendance, I addressed the issues about attainment, I addressed the issues about positive destinations. I will address the fact that on CAMHS waiting times, we are reducing the CAMHS waiting times very significantly for children and young people. There are, of course, challenges in the National Health Service. I want the best for Scotland and I want the best for the National Health Service, which is why there's £21 billion of investment in the Scottish Government's budget that can be deployed to support the National Health Service. It's why I want to make sure that the substantial resources the Education Secretary has secured to invest in education are able to be deployed. But that will only happen if this government passes a budget, this Parliament passes a budget in February. And that's when the Labour Party comes into play. Because are the Labour, I'm interested in the Labour Party's tactics here. Because last night, most of the Labour Party voted in favour of a motion which welcomed the steps in the budget to lift the two-child cap and to restore winter fuel payments to pensioners, and look forward to further discussions with the government about the budget. And I know that those took place this morning with Mr Mara, and I welcome that. There was only one member that didn't vote for that motion last night, and that was Anna Sawa. And it wasn't that he didn't vote for it once. He managed not to vote for it twice. So, really...
Do continue, First Minister.
Just to make it even worse.
All I can say to Mr Sawar is this. If the one thing you've got to do in a day is turn up and vote the right way, and most importantly, vote against an odious motion from the Tories, at least you could be competent enough to do it on the one occasion.
Question number 3, Lorna Slater.
I was disappointed to hear that Scotland's First Minister has been having friendly chats with President-elect Trump, with no discussion of his policy agenda. Donald Trump's climate-destroying, racist and conspiracy theory-based politics are endangering people and planet, and are the exact opposite of the future that we want for Scotland. Here in Scotland, we proudly welcome refugees and immigrants as new Scots. We value democracy,
Let
our
us hear Ms.
environment,
Slater.
and the rule of law. First Minister, how can it be in Scotland's interests to court the favours of someone like Donald Trump?
First Minister.
Presiding Officer, I am responsible for the government's policy programme and its agenda, and that agenda speaks for itself, and I answer questions here on that in a democratic parliament where I believe fundamentally in the rule of law. So Lorna Slater and I are in absolute agreement about the importance of democratic processes and the rule of law, and I believe that it's fundamentally part of my being, the acceptance of that point. But there will, of course, I recognise, be political differences from one government to another. But I also have a duty to promote and to protect the interests of Scotland. And President Trump and I had an introductory call at his request on Tuesday evening, and he spoke positively about Scotland, and I expressed the views of and the interests of the Scottish Government in relation to areas of cooperation with the United States, particularly about relevant and important issues on whisky trade, which matters to the Scottish economy. So I've got a duty to represent Scotland and to make sure that is done on our terms, representing our policy agenda, and I assure Lorna Slater in Parliament that that will always be the approach that I take.
Lorna Slater.
There are risks to a friendly approach. Already we see the Trumpification of Scottish politics. All week, the Tories have been working to demonise people seeking asylum, to pit one group of vulnerable people against another. It is shameful. At the same time, we're seeing the rights of refugees and of LGBTQ+ folks coming under attack from Westminster policies. Will the First Minister stand up to Donald Trump, stand up for human rights, equality and democracy? And will he make clear that we are proud of compassionate and humane policies like the extension of free bus travel to people seeking asylum?
First Minister.
I believe I represent those values every day in all of my actions as the First Minister of Scotland. And I agree with Lorna Slater that this week marked a worrying departure from the prevailing approach that has taken place in the Scottish Parliament. When Their Majesties the King and Queen came to Parliament in September, I quoted from Winnie Ewing, a political figure for whom I could not have more respect, who encouraged us all in this Parliament, in the first words put on the official report of this Parliament, to regardless of where we'd come from, to live compatibly and happily together with tolerance in Scotland. And I said that for 25 years that view had been upheld and expressed by every single Member of Parliament without exception. Yeah. I'm afraid this week represented a turning point in that respect, and I profoundly regret that. What was said on Wednesday by some members of the Conservative Party departs from that approach, and I deeply regret that. On Tuesday evening, under the leadership of the presiding officer, there were public service awards in this Parliament, and one of the awards was given to the Linda Norgrove Foundation, which is a wonderful organisation who succeeded in bringing 19 female medical students from Afghanistan to Scotland, enabled by wonderful cooperation between the United Kingdom Government and the Scottish Government. And I've met those 19 women. The Education Secretary has done so. So has Kirsty McNeill, the Scotland Office Minister. And we welcome all of that. That's what we should be doing as a mature, tolerant country. We should be recognising that people who seek asylum in our country are people who are in desperation, and we shouldn't be demonising them. We should be embracing them. We should be living up to our values, the values that founded this Parliament, and we should turn our back on the populist rubbish that has consumed the Conservative Party this week.
Question number 4, Michelle Thompson.
To ask the First Minister what plans the Scottish Government has to bring forward legislation to criminalise non-fatal strangulation.
First Minister.
Presiding Officer, non-fatal strangulation is an abhorrent act, and I fully recognise the significant physical and psychological impact this type of criminality has on victims and their families. I have met with Fiona Drury, who has explained the basis of the petition that she has presented to Parliament to make non-fatal strangulation a standalone criminal offence. Conduct amounting to non-fatal strangulation is already a criminal offence under the common law of assault and carries maximum penalties of up to life imprisonment. We do, however, constantly keep the law under review, and if there was to be a standalone offence put in place, we would need to be confident there is a gap in the law, and we will be giving this proposal serious consideration.
Michelle Thompson.
I thank the First Minister for that response. Non-fatal strangulation is a known, serious and growing problem. 35% of women between the ages of 16 to 34 have experience of it, and each year that passes sees more violence, strokes and deaths. It's clear that the common law route is not working, and indeed, as Fiona Drury, who lost her daughter, says, we know you are 8 times more likely to be murdered by the person that has strangled you. We cannot ignore that. We can't treat it like common assault, because it's far more complicated, far more complex and far more dangerous than that. A defence of so-called rough sex is being used and accepted by courts. This resonates with the "she asked for it," a misogynistic myth that's taken years to overturn. So, First Minister, doing nothing more is not an option. Proper data collection via criminal health routes is required, an awareness programme is required, and a clearer prosecution route is required. Will the First Minister meet with me, Professor Kath White from the Institute for Addressing Strangulation, Fiona Mackenzie from the We Can't Consent to This, and Linda Thompson from the Women's Support Project to take this issue forward?
First Minister.
I hope in my original answer I indicated the seriousness with which I take this issue, and the Government will give serious consideration to this matter. I do disagree with Michelle Thompson's characterisation of the point I made about this being already a criminal offence under the common law of assault. That is a serious criminal offence, and it carries maximum penalties of up to life imprisonment. But the Government will explore the question of the appropriateness of a standalone offence. But there are many actions that Michelle Thompson has set out in her question which need to be taken, and I'm very happy for the Justice Secretary to take forward a meeting on this respect, and I will obviously be close to the issue. But there is one other thing that needs to change, and that's the behaviour of boys and men. Because I took part in a debate here last Thursday afternoon, because I take deadly seriously my responsibility as a male First Minister of Scotland to make it absolutely clear that the behaviour of boys and men is integral, it is central to the experiences of women in our society. So we will look at all of the measures we need to take in terms of criminal offences. But I will lead from the front a campaign to say to boys and men in Scotland that their behaviour has got to improve.
Tess White. Thank you, Presiding Officer. First Minister, at the Byra's Place event I co-sponsored with Clare Baker last week, we heard alarming feedback about what's going on and the frightening frequency of non-fatal strangulation. Within 6 to 8 seconds, a woman loses consciousness. After 15 seconds, her bladder will be incontinent. After 30 seconds, her bowels will open. She will be brain dead within 4 minutes. I note the First Minister's remarks to Michelle Thompson, and I really ask and I implore him to take a look at the law, and if he believes that common assault reflects the gravity of the crime, and I note that the First Minister has referenced Fiona Drouet, whose daughter Emily tragically took her own life in Aberdeen after being choked by her boyfriend. And I'd like to ask the First Minister to consider meeting with the experts and campaigners and to do it cross-party, like he did with the PLGF testing, and to explore why they're all considering and asking and calling for legislative change. Thank you. First Minister.
Well, I hope I've given enough reassurance to Parliament of the seriousness with which I take this issue. But I really do have to say that it is a very serious criminal matter in the treatment of non-fatal strangulation, and I understand the rationale and the argument for a standalone offence. But I don't want in any way these exchanges to in any way suggest that this practice, which I deplore, carries with it a very serious criminal penalty under common law, which carries maximum penalties of up to life imprisonment. Now, that is a very serious offence, and we will give consideration to the question of a standalone offence, but I don't want in any way these exchanges to suggest that there is anything other than very serious penalties for behaviour of this type.
Clare Baker.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. It is important to recognise that the survey Michelle Thompson has referred to, the third of people who have experienced choking during consensual sex includes men and women, and the survey is showing that non-fatal strangulation during consensual sex is becoming increasingly common to the extent it has been normalised. So on a connected point, earlier this year the Cabinet Secretary for Justice advised me that the Scottish Government would work with key partners on promoting and sharing guidance issued by the Institute for Addressing Strangulation, and that officials would engage with health officials and Police Scotland on non-fatal strangulation and improving pathways between healthcare and policing. So can I ask the First Minister how this work is progressing, the work particularly around the public health messaging that needs to go out to particularly 60 and 35-year-olds where this is increasingly a common practice?
First Minister.
Well, the work that Clare Baker has set out is part of the approach the Government takes on gender-based violence. There is, as I've said, important messages that have to be communicated to change behaviour and practices and to make people aware of the risks of this practice. And it's important that that is informed by the activities of government. And I will ensure that there's a detailed response about the actions that have been taken, given to Clare Baker as a consequence of our exchanges today, to reflect the steps that the government has taken.
Question number 5, Liz Smith.
To ask the First Minister what discussions the Scottish Government has had with local authorities regarding the reported impending closure of library facilities across Scotland.
First Minister.
Presiding Officer, libraries are at the heart of Scotland's communities, and while library policies devolve to local authorities, which have a statutory duty to ensure adequate provision of library services for their residents, they are a hugely important community and cultural resource that is valued by us all.
Liz Smith.
The First Minister will have received the many emails that have come in to Mid-Scotland and Fife MSPs from the Perthshire residents complaining bitterly about the threatened closure of 5 public libraries in Scone, Burnham, Alyth, Cymru and Auchterarder. And I hope he will also recall the evidence that he gave to the Petitions Committee in 2017 when he gave a very firm commitment to support library access for our young people. So in a week where the new statistics show that 2 in 5 Scottish pupils require extra help with their learning, and when members of the public across Perth and Kinross are furious about the impending closures, given that their council tax is being hiked by 10%. Can I ask the First Minister what he believes should happen in order to keep these essential services open?
First Minister.
As Liz Smith will know, I'm really quite familiar with Perth and Kinross since I've had the privilege of representing the county for 27 years, and I intend to carry on representing it for many more years to come. I'll tell Liz Smith what will enrage the people of Perth and Kinross will be a £1 billion unfunded tax cut. Because what that is going to do, and this is where the Conservative Party is really in a mess in Parliament just now, because Liz Smith is a Member of Parliament for whom I have the greatest of respect. And I understand the seriousness of the question she puts to me about libraries. But how is that situation going to be helped if we have a tax cut of £1 billion, which takes £1 billion out of public expenditure? That's going to make the situation much, much, much worse. What the government is doing is the government has given local authorities a real terms increase in their core revenue grant. We've increased the money that's available to local authorities as a whole by £1 billion. Now, I hope out of that, local authorities will be able to make measured decisions about the level of the council tax and about the funding of public services. Now, Liz Smith said that Perth and Kinross Council has implemented a 10% council tax increase. That is not the case. The council has considered indicative council tax increases, but it has not had the financial settlement specific to Perth and Kinross, which will be set out, I think, today, later today. The local government circular will be issued today, and I hope when councils see that, well, first of all, Perth and Kinross will see, because they're planning on a flat cash settlement, and they've got a real terms increase. So they've got more money than they expected, so I'm sure the people in Perth and Kinross will be reassured by my answer and will not be hoodwinked by the false promises of the Conservatives.
Question number 6, Pam Duncan-Glancy.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the First Minister what the Scottish Government's response is to reported comments from the Children and Young People's Commissioners in Scotland that children are being let down by an education system that needs radical reform.
First Minister.
Presiding Officer, on Tuesday the Cabinet Secretary provided a statement to Parliament setting out the Government's long-term strategy for Scottish education. In addition to that, data was set out to Parliament, which I have rehearsed, which sets out the narrowing of the attainment gap and the improvements in attainment within our education system.
Pam Duncan-Glancy.
I thank the First Minister for that answer, and he can list and input selective data he likes, but the reality is plain to see. And I think the Commissioner spoke for many when she said education needs radical reform, but the reality is that's not on offer from this government. The supposed reform bill is little more than a rebrand and will, as the Commissioner also said, barely move us forward while education is in decline. The GMB have said support staff have been left with PTSD. NAS UWT have said the government can't continue to ignore their duty to every child, and parents have said the situation has reached crisis, with a senior head teacher saying, put simply, Scotland is being let down and letting down young people. Passing the buck to local authorities is not acceptable. The sector are screaming the reality, and I'm afraid the government isn't listening. So can I ask the First Minister, why is he right and the Children's Commissioner, teachers, unions and parents wrong?
First Minister.
The government takes forward its education priorities in consultation with all stakeholders in the education system, which is why we have an Education Assurance Board that the government will take forward with local authorities, because local authorities have the statutory, the legal obligation to deliver education in our communities the length and breadth of the country. What the government will do is support that endeavour. So we've put more resources into additional support needs, proposed in the budget, argued for by the Education Secretary. More resources to boost local government funding so that local authorities have got more choice to invest in local authorities. We've taken forward a behaviour action plan. We're taking forward steps to ensure that the attainment gap is narrowed. Now, you see, Pam Duncan-Glancy is going to have to start making some choices. She's got to decide in February, does she support the government's budget? Now, I'm getting a bit more encouraged that the Labour Party might actually see sense, might see that there is an investment that's got to be made in public services, but it only happens if the government's budget passes in this Parliament. It's time for the Labour Party to get off the fence and support the government's budget.
Time is tight. Colleagues, I'd be grateful for concise questions and responses. Jackie Dunbar.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Children in Scotland are undoubtedly being let down. How many children in Scotland have been dragged into or kept in poverty by disgraceful policies like Labour's two-child limit? Can the First Minister please tell the Chamber how the policies of his SNP government and the budget are delivering for Scotland's education system and our bairns and young folk?
First Minister.
President Officer, well, there is a way to address the two-child limit issue that Jackie Dunbar put to me, and that's by passing the government's budget that will take the measures to lift the two-child limit and, as a consequence, lift more children out of poverty. That's the first thing Parliament can do. And, of course, that can be added to the measures that we're taking in the budget to provide the Scottish Child Payment, which is helping to keep 100,000 children out of poverty, and we can help to strengthen the outcomes for young people by supporting the government's budget that invests more in education to support additional support needs and to deliver more teachers. That's some of the action Parliament can take when it supports the government's budget.
Miles Briggs.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. When the First Minister became First Minister, he said enterprise was one of the key aspects of education he wanted to see grow and invested in. Can I ask the First Minister why, therefore, this week the Scottish Government have decided that Youth Enterprise Scotland will not be funded going forward? They are laying off 17 members of their staff. This organisation has delivered this enterprise education to young people across Scotland for 30 years. Why are the Scottish Government deciding to shut them down?
First Minister.
Well, that's not happening. The Government has provided financial support to Youth Enterprise Scotland. We value the work that they're taking forward and will continue to support them.
Thank you. We move to constituency general supplementaries. Again, concise questions and responses appreciated. I call Audrey Nicholl.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. On the subject of the Scottish Budget, this week saw new polling that showed that 78% of Labour voters, 69% of Tory voters and 81% of Liberal Democrat voters support the SNP government's record funding for the NHS in the proposed Scottish Budget. So does the First Minister agree with me that this clearly shows that this budget speaks directly to the priorities of people right across Scotland, and this is vital that opposition parties listen to their voters and support the budget?
Only on matters for which the Government has general responsibility.
Well, President Officer, I take great heart from the motion that was agreed to by Parliament last night, and the only people that voted against this budget motion last night were the Conservatives and Anna Sarwar. So despite Mr Sarwar's opposition, I'm generally more hopeful and optimistic that we're moving in the right direction. And Parliament approved a motion which welcomed the steps in the draft budget to introduce a universal winter heating payment and create the systems necessary to effectively scrap the two-child benefit cap in 2026, and looks forward to further engagement between the Government and the parties represented in the Parliament in advance of the next stage in the budget process. Now, I really welcome the fact that Parliament supported that motion. I'm not certain the Conservatives are obviously in a very poor place now. They're obviously not prepared to be part of the dialogue. They don't even want more discussion about the budget. They've closed the door on that. I'm hoping that Mr Sarwar recovers from his little indiscretion last night and that this indicates that we're moving into a point of agreement, because we deliberately constructed the budget in the hope that it could have broad agreement within the Parliament by the investment in health, in local government, in housing, in cultural funding, and I would encourage Parliament to support the provisions in the budget.
Maurice Golden.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. University Scotland have said the sector is in an immensely difficult place. Dundee University, which is of critical importance to the city and Scotland as a whole, are facing a budget deficit of up to £30 million. In the short term, what reassurance can the First Minister provide to Dundee University staff? And in the long term, Will the Scottish Government consider changes to governance mechanisms to mitigate the risk of this situation arising again at Dundee or indeed any Scottish institution?
First Minister.
Presiding Officer, Mr Golden raises a significant and serious issue. On the general position, the budget settlement enables us to fund over £1.1 billion for teaching and research in our universities, and that's resource that's then distributed through the Scottish Funding Council. As Mr Golden will appreciate, Dundee University, like all universities, is an independent institution, but it is in all of our interests that those independent institutions are able to thrive and flourish. So I've been, like Mr Golden, concerned about the situation at the University of Dundee. It's a very important university in the locality that I represent. So the Funding Council have been engaging with the University of Dundee. The Higher Education Minister, Graham Day, has obviously been engaging as well. And we will work closely, the Funding Council will work closely with the university, but obviously on the understanding that the Government wishes to be kept very close to the discussions to make sure that we can provide exactly the reassurance that Mr Golden asks of me, because it's vital that the university community feel confident about the future. The University of Dundee is a magnificent institution which has got tremendous strength in a variety of different sectors, not least of which its contribution to life science research in Scotland. So it's vital that we make sure the university has a vote of confidence from Parliament today, and I'm very grateful to Mr Gordon for providing me with the opportunity to say exactly that.
Clare Haughey.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm sure the First Minister shared my surprise last night that Anna Sarwar voted with the Conservatives against the SNP Government's budget, which will mitigate against Westminster Labour's cuts in winter fuel payment for pensioners and the callous two-child cap. Yet the rest of the Labour group backed these two policies which will right Labour's wrongs. Does the First Minister agree with me that if the Labour group want to tackle child poverty and support our pensioners, they should support the budget with or without their leader?
First Minister, on matters for which the First Minister has general responsibility.
Presiding Officer, of all the things I've ever thought of Anna Sarwar, I've never had him down as a rebel. But every day is a day of difference. Members will perhaps hear today that I'm gently encouraging the Labour Party to get behind our budget, because I think it does do very good things for Scotland, and I think, given the fact that it now looks pretty obvious that the Conservatives are going to be implacably opposed to the sensible investments in strengthening local authority services and the health service, I'd encourage the Labour Party to get in behind us.
Faisal Chowdhury.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. An investigation into Edinburgh Maternity Hospital found that mothers and newborn babies came to harm from a toxic culture fuelled by staffing shortage. This comes almost a year after BMA Scotland warned NHS staffing levels were becoming dangerously low. We are now seeing the consequences, with mothers and newborn needlessly being put at risk by SNP's mismanagement on our NHS. Will the First Minister listen to this concern, stop pretending nothing is wrong, and step up to protect patients and staff?
First Minister.
Presiding Officer, Mr Chowdhury raises a very significant issue, and I have naturally been very close to the issues that have been raised about this in the course of the last couple of days. The first thing I want to do is to make it clear that there is the greatest importance attached to ensuring the safety of all services in the National Health Service, and that must be especially the case in relation to maternity services. And we have taken forward in Scotland a patient safety perinatal improvement programme, which has a great deal of international commendation because of its focus on patient safety. We have also taken forward steps to increase the number of qualified midwives, and there has been an increase of those over the last 10 years and especially in the last year. But having said all of that, the issues that have been raised publicly about the climate within NHS Lothian maternity services are not acceptable, and they must be addressed. And the Health Secretary is insisting with NHS Lothian that these issues are addressed, because mothers must feel safe going into maternity services. I consider, on the best advice available to me, that those services are safe, and I would reiterate that point to Mr Chowdhury today. but I don't want in any way to suggest anything other than there must be improvements in the relationships within NHS Lothian maternity services to make sure that the fundamental concerns that have been raised by the whistleblowers are properly and fully resolved, because that will be in the interests of mothers and babies in the maternity services in Lothian.
Thank you. That concludes First Minister's questions. Point of order, Douglas Lumsden.
Presiding Officer, under the Parliament Standing Orders, written questions about the operation of the systems of criminal prosecution and investigation of deaths are answerable only by the law officers, as are oral questions on those matters in all but exceptional circumstances. Last week, I asked a question regarding provision of forensic pathology services in Aberdeen. I was expecting to hear from the Lord Advocate, as this function falls under her responsibility, but the question was instead dealt with by the Cabinet Secretary for Health. So can I ask you, Presiding Officer, if there were any exceptional circumstances conveyed to you why the Lord Advocate was not able to attend Parliament on the 5th of December to fulfil her responsibilities?
I thank Mr Lumsden for his point of order. I would say that the rules allow answers to be given by another member of the government, and it is a matter for the government to determine whether the circumstances warrant this. We have concluded First Minister's questions. The next item of business is a member's business debate in the name of David Torrance, and there will now be a short suspension to allow those leaving the gallery and the chamber to do so.
Hello and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. My name is Lewis McGlynn.
Hello and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. My name is Saoirse Healy.
Hello and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. My name is Donald C. Stewart. Broadcasting Scotland is Scotland's independent broadcaster, providing factual news, reporting on the issues important to the people of Scotland.
We are committed to public service broadcasting, and with your support, we will produce even more programmes.
Provide opportunities for young people interested in media production and broadcasting, and challenge preconceptions of what Scottish media looks like, amplifying Scotland's voice and reflecting its communities.
We can already deliver high-quality live news, and we will create the highest quality programmes for you to enjoy, but we can only do that with your support.
So please subscribe to and share our channel or donate to Broadcasting Scotland via the link in the description. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.